This is Preach the Word, what everyone should know about preaching. Again, the point of this class is not to necessarily teach you how to write a sermon or to preach, but that every Christian is going to hear sermons, so you should know what a sermon is, what to expect from a sermon. So the first couple of weeks we've talked about sort of theology of preaching that grows out of a theology of the Word because God has spoken. Therefore, we must speak. And so we talked about what that looks like, the commitments, if you're going to preach, the commitment to the pre-commitments of the expositor, the commitment to the Word. We talked about all those last week. Today, we're going to talk about really sort of the process of moving from text through sermon. Next week, I'm going to give you, before we leave, I want to give you an outline for today's sermon and then give you permission to critique it and to think through it as you hear the sermon today. We'll sort of go through this process that we talked about today. With the sermon you hear today, we'll walk through that text next week. Then the week after, we'll walk through together the text of Malachi. This is the second to last Sunday. Next week, I'll finish Philippians, and then we'll start Malachi. And so we'll begin to work together on that text and sort of try to move from text to sermon with one of the texts in Malachi. And then the last week, we'll talk about listening, how to come prepared for hearing a sermon, what to do during a sermon, what to do after a sermon, and listening to sort of let you know where we're going. So today we're talking about moving from text to the actual sermon and sermon delivery, the actual preparation of preaching. So if you guys were here the first couple weeks, you'll know this. Hopefully you'll remember this answer. When should the pastor finish his sermon? When is the sermon finished? Yeah, when the fat lady sings. When the sermon is finished, when it is preached, right? You may finish preparation, right? Different pastors do different things. You may finish, some guys get up early Sunday morning and do stuff. You may finish preparation, but the sermon is not the thing that's on the paper. The sermon is the event. The sermon is the thing that takes place in the gathered body of the church. So you might have things on a paper, but that paper is not the sermon. If that were the sermon, it'd be easier. We'll just send you a copy of that paper and everybody just read the paper. But the sermon is the event. So even in thinking through preparation and preparing to preach, we are preparing to preach, not preaching our preparation. And what I mean by that is that all of the prep that you do, even the writing of a sermon outline, all of that is in service to the text, right? If we said the point of preaching is to expose and explain and apply the Word of God, then all the prep is simply to help us preach the Word. What can happen sometimes is we get so caught up in the prep that we end up preaching the prep. The sermon outline should not be what you're preaching. You're not preaching the sermon outline. The outline is a tool to help you to preach the text. Does that make sense? So that you don't want to get caught on the stuff that's on the page. The primary thing is the Word, and everything you're doing is preparing to be able to preach the Word clearly. So we're going to talk about sort of what that looks like some today. Think about preaching. You can break it up into just evaluating it and putting it together into three categories: text, sermon, and delivery. And these are the three we'll work through today. So by text we mean the understanding and the handling of the Word. Do you understand it? Do you get the main point? Do you understand the words? Do you understand the argumentation? What is being taught there? Then the sermon would be the sermon outline, would be the words you say, right? Have you understood the Word? And then is what you say in the sermon, does it flow out of that? Does it make sense? Can it be followed? Can it be remembered? This is the thing of the sermon outline. And then the delivery is then how you say what you say, right? That this is what you should be focusing on. This is what you say, and then this is how you say what you say. This is the delivery portion of it. So you can fail in some of these areas. You may have in your mind a great sermon outline and great delivery, but if you fail here, is it a good sermon? No, it's not a good sermon. If the point of sermons is that we would preach the Word, if we fail to understand the text, in that sense, our outline is irrelevant, and our delivery is really, actually, probably hurtful. Right? If you're good and persuasive and charismatic in delivery, but you've not understood the text, congratulations, you're a cult leader. Right? This is what a lot of preaching is. It abandons the text. It has cute, clever outlines and really, really personable delivery, but it's divorced from the text. Well, that's not a sermon. That's a nice talk. So can you, if you get the text right, and your sermon is understandable, but your delivery is lacking some, can it be a good sermon? Yeah, it can be, right? So this is when we'll talk more about this in the third week, or in the 6th week rather, when we judge sermons. Often when you've walked out of a service and thought, that was a really good sermon, or that was not as good, right? Maybe you wouldn't use the word bad, but that was tough. That was a tough listen. Often what we end up doing is we end up judging those sermons 80% by delivery. Is that was he able to deliver it well? Did he know his notes? Could he use his voice, right? What happens then is that we sometimes think, well, that was a tough sermon. But really, maybe the delivery was shaky, but it was faithful to the text. And the outline flowed out of the text and helped me to understand the word. So it's a faithful sermon. Maybe it was the easiest thing to listen to. Maybe not. But you can stumble here some, and it still be a faithful sermon. So we don't want to stumble there. We want to do our best in delivery. But what I want to guard against is judging sermons solely by delivery. Right? We want to work on that. There's ways to do that. But you can come out of sermons. You've walked out of sermons and thought that was great, that if you would go back and look at what was actually preached, there's nothing there, right? That it's all being carried by the person. It's all carried by delivery and not by the actual text or by the sermon outline. What happens if you have a great understanding of the text and you feel comfortable in delivery, but you don't feel that great about your sermon outline? Can it be a faithful sermon? Yeah, it could be a faithful sermon. The goal of this sermon outline is to help us understand the text. Sometimes those come really easily, and sometimes they don't. And sometimes it's somewhere in between. And so the goal is to help these sermon outlines flow from the text. But what I want you to see here, what is the primary thing? You got to get the text right. Right? There's ways to grow in these other pieces, but you have to get the text right. If you don't get that right, then everything else is irrelevant. And at best irrelevant. At worst, it's damaging. That if you're really good at putting outlines together and you're a really great communicator and you don't understand the text, you can do a lot of damage because you become convincing. But if what you're saying is not flowing from the word, you could do a ton of damage. So it is imperative that we get the text right. So 3 aspects of a sermon: text delivery, text, sermon, and delivery. So under text, think about 3 broad categories.
I find your Henry stories help me remember things.
Illustrations, when you talk about those, we'll talk about those in a minute more. They often work like pegs to hang stuff on. That you can remember stories, and so you can hang truth on those things and use what you already know, or it's easy to remember the thing that's harder to remember. So when
I read once, I'm not sure if we got the right person, but I think it was Jonathan Edwards. They said that brilliant man and just used of God, but yet his delivery was not always just real outstanding and a bit more of a monotone.
Yeah.
Every word.
Yeah, where like Whitefield was the opposite. Whitefield was an incredible orator. Edwards was not. People threw dead cats at Edwards once when he preached. He was a pretty boring guy just as far as delivery. So let's think through text. We'll talk more about illustrations in a moment when we get to sermon. So thinking through the 3 sort of pieces of understanding the text, which this is true not just for preachers but for anybody. When we do our What is the Bible class and think about just understanding and interpreting the Bible, these are the 3 sort of categories we talk about often: is context, content, and concern. So context, if you've been at Buck Run for any time, you've heard Herschel say context is everything. Context is really important when you think about the text. So we're thinking then, what is happening in this text? So as we looked at the book of Philippians, working through Philippians now for most of the spring, we're we have the benefit of going week after week to the next passage, so that we're building, even as we go, we're building this context. We're looking not just at a passage divorced from all the things that are around it, but we're looking at that passage in the context of all the things that are going on. So a few pieces of context, just categorically, that we'll think through as we think about biblical context. Number one is the historical context. To think through what is happening at the time of the writing. What's the historical context? What's happening in and around the writing of that text? We're really far removed from that. I don't live in first century Philippi. I don't live under Roman rule. I don't experience in the same way exactly the same thing all that the Philippians did. So it's important for us to think about, well, what was the historical context that was happening then? Where does this take place? Who was writing it? What was happening in the world at this time? What context clues are we given in the text that tell us about what's happening in the world at this time? We'll use this as an example. Go to John chapter 4. It's a great place to sort of look that works really well for simply sort of understanding context of what's happening in and around the world at that time. John chapter 4, the story of the woman at the well. We're not going to read it all. But hopefully you've heard this story before. Jesus is coming. The text tells us that he has to pass through Samaria, though he didn't have to geographically. He chooses to pass through Samaria. He meets this Samaritan woman at the well, and he has this encounter with her. Part of what we're asking when we're thinking about the historical context is geographical. Where does this thing take place? So in the story of the woman at the well, where does that take place? At a well, where? In the desert, yeah, and specifically in Samaria. So there's a geographic region. There's a specific place that this is taking place, at a well in a city in Samaria. Why does that matter? Let's think about the historical context. What's going on in Samaria? How does Samaria come to be in existence? What is it? Jews and Samaritans don't like each other. Why? And they came and they mixed them. And so the Samaritans are those who have this mixture of Pentateuch, Old Testament, Yahweh worship, with this other sort of cultish Assyrian, or sort of pseudo-Babylonian, really their own thing, Canaanite religion. So they are sort of this mixed, both religiously. The Jews saw them as mixed ethnically, right? That they were not fully Jewish, that they were a mixture of Jewish people, and then Canaanites and Babylonians and Assyrians. They were this sort of melting pot, and so the Jews and the Samaritans did not get along. They did not like each other. You can go back and read in the Old Testament sort of the history of how you get there. We get some of that. So part of that is thinking through the geographical context. Where are they? They're in Samaria. The historical context. Well, we need to understand a bit about the history of Samaria, which then, if we understand the geographical context, we get a bit of what John is saying when he says that Jesus was traveling, and he had to, in verse 4, he had to pass through Samaria. And we know that that's the easiest route. That's the straightforward route, but we know from history that that's not the route most Jews took, because they didn't want to go through Samaria. They would cross over the Jordan and go up the long way. Jesus intentionally makes a decision to pass through Samaria. Again, that's not random. What helps there is understanding this historical context, what's happening with Samaria, so that even this conversation that Jesus has with her about worship, where do you say, where she says, where do you say that we, or he says, where do you say we should worship? And she's talking about, well, you Jews say here, and we say on Mount Gerizim. What is that? That we're understanding some of the historical background of what's happening, the context there. So there's a geographical context, there's a historical context, there's a cultural context. Understanding a bit about that culture. So in this text, what time does the woman go to the well? In the middle of the day. Is that what time in the culture that women would go to the well? No. When did they go? Go early in the morning. Why early in the morning? It's cooler because it's the desert and it's hot and you need water to do everything to the day, to cook, to clean, do all the stuff. So they would go early in the morning. It was a social event, right? You went and got your water for the day and you visited with the other women in the village. So John is not just giving us this sort of unimportant detail that she comes in the middle of the day. That if you understand the cultural context, this tells us something about why she comes in the middle of the day. Why does she want to come in the middle of the day? Yeah, she's an outcast. She don't want to be around the other people. And in some sense, I think the implication, if you read through the chapter, is they don't want to be around her. Right? That she has been put out to the side because of the life that she's lived. Again, how do we get there? We understand a bit of the cultural context. It would not, if you told me I went to Kroger today at lunchtime, I wouldn't say, oh my word, are you going to Kroger at lunchtime because everybody hates you? That's not, our culture doesn't work that way, right? But in first century, for a Jew to hear, and she went to the well at midday, is a red flag. Well, why is she doing that? It would be like an immediate, if you said, I went to Kroger at 3 a.m., then I would say, is everything okay? Like, are you doing okay? Is your work schedule weird? Right? So that is a thing. Culturally, they would understand that. So we're thinking through cultural context, historically, geographically, culturally, religiously. Right? Again, this woman is a Samaritan. So it's not just historically, but religiously, she has this sort of syncretistic religion that is part Old Testament, part pagan Canaanite worship, all of these things put together. A good example in the Old Testament is Gideon. Understanding Gideon, when he's under threat, he's threshing wheat in the winepress because he's afraid. Where do you normally thresh wheat? On the hill. And Gideon's threshing it in the winepress because he's afraid, and he's threshing it in the valley. Where do you normally thresh wheat? Up high. You need to be high. You need to be open so that the wind can carry. He's in the winepress, in the valley, so that when, do you remember what's the angel say when the angel comes to him, when he comes to him? Oh yeah, mighty man of valor. What is he? It's ironic. It's, aren't you so brave, Gideon, threshing wheat in the winepress down here in the valley because you're afraid, right? There's some irony there. How do we understand that? We have to know some of the cultural aspects of what was normal for doing these things, for threshing wheat. It was not normal to thresh wheat in the valley in the winepress. It was actually the opposite of what you would normally do. So we're looking at some of the historical context, culturally, geographically, religiously, thinking through what is happening at the time. We cannot do this part. We cannot apply the text to our culture and to our situation unless we first understand what was happening in the original culture and situation. That sometimes our temptation is to apply the text in a way that would be completely foreign to the first hearers and the first writer. Now, is our situation different? Yes. Again, we don't live in first century Philippi, but the principles here are the same, right? That we ought to apply the text to our lives in the same sort of way that it is not foreign to what the first hearers would have understood. So we're thinking through the context historically. We're thinking through the context textually. So if we're thinking through just under here context, there's a big historical bucket, culturally, religiously, geographically. The second one is textual. What's going on in the book that this in? Where is this in the book? Where is this in this overall flow of the argument? What's happening in this individual book? How are these things connected? We're going to see in the passage this morning in Philippi that this is the last exhortation in the book, and that everything Paul says in this really he's already said. That he's taking, this is the end of the letter. He's going to have his customary at the end of this, the thank you for doing this and thank you for doing that, and right, the sort of thanks and the final sort of farewells. But the exhortation of the letter ends in this passage today, and he's taking all the things that he's saying and he's sort of distilling them down into a few quick exhortations. Right, that he's just sort of closing the letter by reminding them and pushing all these things together. Here's what I've said. Well, we know that because we've worked our way through the letter. So we're understanding what he's saying here. So in this text this morning, when Paul talks about joy, we realize it's not the first time Paul's talked about joy in the letter. But Paul is bringing in all the things he said about joy and sort of sticking it into this passage. When Paul talks about rejoicing always, we know that this is in the context of suffering. Because Paul's been talking about joy and suffering from the beginning, from the first chapter of the letter. So we're understanding, where does this come in the flow of the letter? Where does this come in the context of the letter? And then more broadly, where does this come in the context of all of the Bible? So thinking through Genesis to Revelation, where is this? Is this Old Testament? Is this New Testament? Is this gospel? Is this a New Testament epistle or a letter? Where is this? Where does it come in the overall flow of all of the progress of Revelation? Where does it fit into there? And the last context, if you're taking notes, historical context, textual context, and then number 3 is the literary context. What we mean here is, what type of writing is it? what type is it? Is it a gospel? Is it history? Is it apocalyptic? Is it wisdom? Is it a letter? All of these have different types of writing. Just you read different types of writing all day, every day. You read work emails differently than you read the sports section of the newspaper, differently than you read a text from your family, or differently than you read junk mail that you get out of your mailbox. We have all of these different genres of literature that we understand. They have particular aspects, they have particular characteristics, they're written in a particular style, and understanding a bit about that genre helps us to understand what's happening. So we talked through this some when I just went through Proverbs, or did an overview of Proverbs in the sanctuary. Understanding that Proverbs is wisdom literature. Understanding something about wisdom literature helps us to understand Proverbs. That when we come to wisdom literature is saying to us, this is the best way to walk. This is walking according to the wisdom of God, according to the design and the plan of God. The wisdom literature of the Bible is not saying, if you do A plus B, you'll always get C. Wisdom is not giving that level of promise. Wisdom is saying, you ought to do A and plus B. You ought to do these things. And most of the time in the world, you're going to get C. That there's the general principles for living. So understanding that helps us to understand the Proverbs. So when we read Solomon say, train up a child in the way that he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. That we read that not as the Bible promising, if you do your best to raise your children well, then they will never walk away from Jesus. That's not the promise of the text. But what is it? It is saying the wise thing to do is from early years to raise your children well. And generally, if you do that, often what will happen is they won't walk away from the faith, that they'll remain faithful. It doesn't mean it will always happen, but generally that's the way that it works. So understanding something about genre helps. So thinking about the text of Philippians, what genre is Philippians? It's a letter, right? It's a New Testament letter. It is built on basically logic. Paul is using grammar and syntax to build logical arguments for us that you can, in almost all these texts, you can go in and you can find where are my finite verbs, where are my commands, where are my imperatives, and then I can tell Paul is giving me imperatives, and then he's building things off of those imperatives. That's why if you've paid attention to the sermon outlines, we've had a lot of sections where it's like, do this thing, but in this way, with this thing, like this, because Paul is giving us one big command, and then he's building grammatically lots of things off of that. That's a feature of New Testament epistles. If you go, say, to the Gospels, right, it's an entirely different thing. That you can preach the New Testament epistles almost just sort of strictly. The structure of the text will almost always give you the structure of the sermon because it's a logical, they all connect together. If you go and you preach a parable or you preach a story of healing in the Gospels, it's a different thing. It's a narrative. It's a story. And so you've got to piece that story together in a different way. You've got to understand the beginning and the middle and the tension and the resolution and how are these pieces fitting together and what's he saying to us, and then how does that relate to us now on the backside of the cross. We're thinking through some of these things that come in the context. Does that make sense? All right, again, there's a ton more we could say there, but we want to know what's the context. Where does this fit? Number two is content. Think about this then. Content is, what does the text say? In what context does it say it? Where does it come? Historically, within the Bible, within that book. Content then is, what is the text actually saying? This is where we have to look at the words. What are the words? What is it that Paul's saying? What is it that John is saying? Or what is it that Moses is saying? That we're examining the words. We're looking structurally. How do these words fit together? So that is all the way down to individual words, but then putting words together in sentences, together in paragraphs, together in larger sections, together with a whole book. We're asking, how do these things fit together? We use often in this, we talked about this a little bit, I think Wednesday night a couple weeks ago, the hermeneutical spiral. It is the way that systematic theology and biblical theology interact with one another. Systematic theology almost always starts with a question outside of the text. A question like, who is God? What is man? What is sin? It's a question that starts outside the text that then moves in towards the text to get an answer. Biblical theology is a question that begins in the text and then can grow towards systematic theology. So biblical theology, if this says, who is God? Biblical theology says, what does Exodus 1 through 4 tell us about the nature and the character of God? Does it make sense? That you're beginning in the text, but they're always sort of flowing into one another, right? So when you're answering systematic theology questions, where do you go? To the Bible. You have to go to the text. And when you're asking questions of an individual text like Exodus 1 through 4, what does this tell us about the nature and the character of God? Even as you answer that question from that text, you're having to answer that question not just from Exodus 1 through 4, but in light of the totality of all that the Bible says, and with the guardrails then of what? Systematic theology, they're always playing into one another. So we think about this as we come to the content of thinking about content. So when I think about what Paul says in Philippians, I have to think about what he says there, right? I have to answer the biblical theology question, while at the same time understanding that this is not the only revelation in the Bible. I've got 65 other books. And so that I'm holding this in context and thinking through what Paul says in light of what Paul says in his other letters, in light of what Jesus says, in light of what Moses says, in light of what God has said throughout all of the history of the scriptures. So putting these things together. Thinking about the text at a grammatical level, I didn't learn anything about diagramming sentences until I had to learn Greek. I don't know what that says about the American education system. I couldn't diagram English sentences until I had to learn how to diagram English sentences, to diagram the Greek New Testament and then the Hebrew Old Testament to a different degree. But when we come to the text, we're thinking grammatically. What are the sentences that are there? How do they fit together? What words are being used? That when you come to a text, especially New Testament epistles, if Paul gives a command, well, there's a big red flag that says that's probably pretty important, right? That we often, if we go back to where we talked about first week, the different types of preaching that we don't want to do, the inebriated preaching, where inebriated preaching is where the preacher uses the text like a drunk uses the light pole, more for support than for illumination. That it's just the thing he sort of starts with, or inspired preaching where you read the text and you just sort of wait for a word or a phrase to jump out at you and then you just sort of go off that word. What's the problem there? You might pick a phrase that's not the main point, and then you make that thing that is a subpoint the main point, and then you've missed the text, right? You're not doing what Paul is aiming to do with the text. And so we're looking to look at the grammar and the syntax. How do these words fit together? So that when Paul gives me a command in the text, well, then part of what I'm doing in my outline is that needs to be a command. That needs to be something I'm emphasizing, because that's part of what Paul is emphasizing. So I don't want to take the sub-point and make it the main point, because that's not what Paul's doing. I want to look at what is the actual grammar and the syntax of what Paul is doing, both at the microstructure, so even within sentences and within paragraphs, but then also at the macrostructure. What is Paul doing in the totality of the whole book? How are all these things fitting together, from words to sentences to paragraphs to larger divisions? So we're looking structurally at the actual words, and then we're looking thematically. What are the things that come up theme-wise? Again, this week in Philippians is a great example of this, because it is like Paul has had all of these threads throughout the book of Philippians about peace and joy and unity and love with one another and rejoicing in the midst of suffering and thinking about the right things and putting those things into practice. He's had all of these threads that have been weaving, and then what does Paul do? All these themes, in this text, if you'll notice, he takes them all and he brings them together. He sort of ties it off very, very neatly. If you'll notice, everything that Paul has brought up in the letter finds its way into this passage, because he's taking all these themes that he's had, that he's talked about individually, and then now he brings them all together to bring it to a close. So we're thinking thematically, looking for particular words or vocab that he repeats a lot, that comes up again and again and again. What are words we've seen a lot in the book of Philippians? Rejoicing. We've seen thinking. Paul has used either the phrase, think this way, have this mind in you, what we do with our minds matter. The striving side by side, this unity together has come up again and again and again. What you do, not just what you think, but how you actually live your life, what you put into practice has come up again and again and again. Again, we're going to see all these things sort of tied together in this passage. So we're thinking, what are the vocab? What words come up again? What themes does he keep returning to again and again and again? If you go to Hebrews chapter 11, it's a great example. What is the main theme of Hebrews chapter 11? What's the phrase that is used again and again and again? By faith. The writer, whoever it is talking about all these Old Testament saints and the way that they were saved and the way that God worked through them, and he says it's by faith. It's not by accident. That the vocab there is telling us he is emphasizing not their works, but he's emphasizing their faith. That they did this by faith, and he did this by faith, and he saw this by faith. That there is the theme, just looking at the pattern of words. Number 2 is the literary pattern. Right? How is he putting these things together? Again, what vocab is he using? 3, we have to fly a little bit through these. Theological patterns. What does the passage say about God? What's it emphasizing? What keeps coming up again and again and again? So we're looking here, if you're just thinking through context, content, and concern. The content is, what's the text say? Right? What words are being used there? And then, what does the text say? And then the third, concern, is answering the question of application. Answering the question, what is the text doing? So if you remember, I think I gave this example in the first week. If Frank comes up here to say something to me, and coming up here, Frank steps on my foot, and I lean over and say, hey, Frank, you're on my foot. What is the content of what I've said? Have I given an imperative? No, I've given an indicative statement. I've given a statement of fact. Hey, Frank, you're on my foot. That's the content of what I've said. What am I doing with what I'm saying? Given the context of what's happening, given the context of that we have this shared language and Frank is standing on my foot, if I say, hey, Frank, you're on my foot, what is the concern there? What am I doing with that? Yeah, there's a command in that, implied, right? Hey, you're on my foot, I need you to get off my foot, right? So we're asking the question, not just what the text says, but what's he doing with it? Why is he writing this text? And again, we don't make this up. Where do we get this from? We get this from the text. Right? We pay close attention to the so that's and the therefores. We pay close attention to what the writer is saying so that when he tells us these truths, that he tells us, here's why I'm telling you this thing. I'm telling you this so that you'll do this, so that you'll think this way, you'll believe this way, you'll worship this way, so that you'll do these things, that we understand not just what he's saying, but why he's saying it. Again, so think through the passage today in Philippians chapter 4. He's not saying these things merely so that they'll understand more about prayer, or understand more about what it means to rejoice, or understand more about standing firm. Why does he tell them this? So that they'll actually do it. Because they're in the midst of suffering, and he wants them to stand firm. He wants them to not just think about these things, but to actually, he's going to say, put these things into practice. What you've learned and seen and heard, do them. Put these things into practice. That he's telling us what he wants us to do. So understanding the concern of the text. So in the epistles, this is often really easy to discern, because Paul or whoever's writing often tells us very directly, here's why I'm writing this, so that you'll do this thing. It gets harder some when you go to let's say the Gospels, and you're looking at a narrative, and we get a story about Jesus healing somebody. Okay, well, we get the content. Okay, this person was blind, and Jesus came and healed them and opened their eyes. That's what happened. Why do I know it? Why did this writer by the Holy Spirit write this text? That's the question we have to ask. It can't just be, okay, what did we learn about Jesus in this text? You ought to learn a lot, but there is something the text is calling you to do. Why did he write this? So this is why every time I preach John's gospel, I come back to John's own thematic, essentially, here's the reason why I'm writing everything at the end of John's gospel. Do you remember what John says? I've written all these things. There's a lot of other things that couldn't have been written that I didn't write, but I wrote these things that you would see that Jesus is the Christ and believe in him, and by believing have faith. So that every piece of content in John's gospel, every story, every narrative, every teaching, you can go to every piece of John's gospel and put that thematic sort of lens over top of it and help you understand what's he doing. So you think, well, why does John tell me this story about the healing of the man at the pool of Bethesda? Why does he do that? So that I would see that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and believe in him, and by believing have faith. So then now I can ask of that question, of that text, what about the healing specifically? What about this specific instance of Jesus with the man at the pool of Bethesda? What about this is John specifically wanting me to see that leads me to believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and would lead me to trust in him? What's he doing specifically in this, right? So that I'm using then John's own thematic sort of purpose statement to help me understand the individual pieces. So asking, what does the text say, and then what's he doing with the text? What is the What's the concern? This is where we begin to get into contemporary application. We've thought through the context, we've thought through the content, we've thought through then the concern. So what is Paul wanting them to do? So if we think about the book of Philippians, what is Paul wanting them to do? To live their lives in light of the gospel of Jesus. We can sum up that way, right? To live as citizens worthy of the gospel of Christ. In steadfastness and in joy and in unity and peace with each other and with the Lord. Okay, well, that's really clear. Does that translate to my life? Absolutely. Does my context look the exact same? No. So if Paul is saying to them, I want you to live your life in light of the gospel, to live as citizens worthy of the gospel, in joy, even in suffering, and in peace and unity with one another, and in faithfulness, well then what then should be the point of the sermon? That we who live in Frankfort in 2024 should live as citizens worthy of the gospel, in joy and in faithfulness and in peace with God and with one another, united, striving side by side for the gospel, right? So again, the specifics may look different, but we begin to get the application for the sermon really by getting here. You can't short circuit this process. You can't just jump. You can't read John 4 and say, well, what's the application of John 4? It is, don't talk to strange men at wells. Right? Well, no, that's not the application. No, we got to jump. We got to go down here. We got to work through the text. What's the context? What's the content? What's the concern then of the text? Again, so if we put this in John's gospel, what's the concern of John chapter 4? That you would believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and by believing you might have faith in him. Now, there are specific ways we see that in John 4, but that's the main point, that you would trust Jesus and believe and have faith. And we see that come out in this experience with the woman at the well. Why does Jesus reveal to her things about her life? Not because Jesus wants to do a magic trick and impress her. What's he doing? He wants to expose her heart. He wants to bring her to faith. He wants her to understand, I see every piece of you. I understand the very things that you're trying to hide, I see. And yet he welcomes her in. So at the end of that passage, the beginning of the passage, you see this woman who's going to the well at the middle of the day to avoid everybody. At the end of the passage, she's encountered Jesus. Do you remember what she does? She goes and tells everybody and says, come meet a man. Do you remember what she says? Who told me everything I've ever done. She's hiding from people because of everything she's ever done. And now she comes to the town and is like, all those things that all you know about me, come meet this guy. He knows them too, right? It's an amazing passage. Why? Because she's coming to see that Jesus is the Christ. And that she's trusting him, and by believing in him, she has life. So we're thinking through context, content, and concern. Makes sense on the text side. Yes. Okay. Let's go through sermon. We can do this relatively quickly. Herschel would say, you are not ready to preach your sermon until you can pass the 3 a.m. test. Anybody know what the 3 a.m. test is? It is if someone were to shake you awake 3 a.m. the night before you're supposed to preach and say, what are you preaching tomorrow? If you can't answer that in a sentence or two, then you're not ready to preach.
Like your elevator speech.
Yeah, like if you're not ready to say quickly the general, here's what the sermon is about, right? Then you're not yet done. You're not yet to the place where you're ready to preach that text. And so if we're thinking through how the sermon goes together, that we're thinking through, again, the main point of the sermon. If you think through as this sort of big bar, this is the main point of the sermon. Where do we get the main point? From the text. So whatever the main point of the text is, that ought to be then, as best we can, the main point of the sermon. If that's the main point of the text, that's what I want to be the main point of the sermon. So the subpoints of the text should be the subpoints of my sermon, right? That I'm allowing the text to drive the sermon. So if you think about the main point this way, as sort of the big piece, and then you have A, B, and C. We're good Baptists, so you only ever have 3 divisions in your sermon. You have as many as the text requires. But a lot of times it's 3 to 5-ish. Often if you're taking smaller chunks, normally there's only 3 to 5 sort of subpoints. But notice how these subpoints are all connected to what? They run through the main point, right? So the text has a main point. Can you say in the 50-minute sermon, can you say everything there is to say about a text in 50 minutes? No. Right? But can you say the main point? And can you give the main structure of the text that help people see how the subpoints connect to the main point, so that everything we say, we are connecting and driving back to the main point. So that here's the main point of the sermon. I try to do this in preaching very early on in the sermon. Here's the main point. Here's what I want you to get. And then as we move into the subpoints, I'm trying, and don't always do this well, to show how those main points connect back both to each other, but really to the main point. So today, the main point of this sermon is stand firm. Stand firm like this, right? Thusly, the good King James word. Stand firm thusly. Stand firm like this. And so the subpoints of the sermon are stand firm, well, like what? Like this. So do this in order to stand firm. Do this. That's what standing firm looks like. Do this. That's what standing firm looks like. That they are connected to one another, but they're really connected and run through this ultimate main point, so that at everything we're doing, we're driving back to the main point. Generally, in these subpoints, you're going to have three things. Explanation, application, and illustration. You're going to explain the text. So for me today, this would be verses 2 through 3. This would be 4 through 7. And this would be 8 through 9. The text breaks up that way. Again, this is an epistle. These are easier to deal with. So when I get to 2 through 3, and I give you that main point, or that subpoint there, and the way it's connected to the main point, the first thing I'm going to attempt to do is then to explain what I've just said and to prove that it's from the text. So that here's my point, but here I want you to see where this point comes from the text. So I want to explain the vocab. I want to explain the grammar, what's happening there, what is Paul saying, what does Paul mean by what he's saying. I want to explain it. You cannot illustrate it or apply it until you've explained it. You've got to explain. Here's, in very plain terms, here's what the text is saying. Then, again, you're not always going to have an illustration, but then illustration is helping to illuminate. Either illustrations do one of two things. And if they don't do either of those things, then they shouldn't be there. They either help to explain the text, so that you use a picture, an illustration, to help somebody to understand, okay, I've just given you this concept. Here's an illustration to help you think through that concept, to see it in a real way. Or illustrations help to apply. So I've explained the concept, and you understand the concept, but you might have a hard time thinking, well, what does that actually look like in practice? You use an illustration that helps to explain, oh, here's what this looks like in actual thing. I'm going to go ahead and pass these out. You can see them. These are not proofread. These are my notes for today. So there's an example in here. There is a place where we're going to talk today about being unified in the body, about learning to get along with one another, being at peace in the body. So you'll notice I tried to explain that concept. What does Paul mean by that? What does he mean by be at peace with one another, and encouraging these two women to agree in the Lord? Then I'm going to use an illustration about Mark Pope and the introductory press conference to illustrate how the concept that Paul gives is not that we will always agree on every instance of everything in the body, but that because we believe the gospel and we've labored together in the gospel and we're all going to be in heaven together, that we can find a way to get along in this life, in the body, right? That's the point. So then we think, well, how does that work? How is that possible? How can we disagree with one another and still get along? Well, I went to Rupp Arena last week with 20,000 UK fans. And if you put 20,000 UK fans in an arena, you have 25,000 opinions about what Kentucky should do. And yet, in that arena, what's happening? There's unity. Why? Because they have a common goal, right? They are finding ways, even though they might disagree with one another on strategy or opinion or preference, there were grown men around me crying in that stadium, right? They find a way to be unified. When the common goal is the main thing, they find a way to get along. Well, what is that? That's an illustration that helps to explain the principle from the text. So then the application of that is, you are in the church with people, and you're not always going to agree with them. You're going to decide on different things about how to school your kids or how to parent them or marriage or politics any number of tertiary issues. There's going to be preference issues and opinion issues and strategy issues of how we're to do things together for the gospel, that we're not always going to agree with one another on all of those things. But if we have believed the same gospel and we're laboring together in the gospel and we're going to be in heaven together, then Paul says we can find a way to get along here. Right? So there's the explanation, illustration, application. Generally, your 3 main points are going to have that. What does the text say? Do I need an illustration to help either explain the text or to help lead me to application? And then, and all of that, I'm connecting it back up here to the main point. So this is where illustrations come in. Illustrations are helpful for either explanation or application, and they become pegs by which, when I tell a Henry story, I'm trying to use those specifically so that people remember, okay, here's this story, and what am I doing? I'm hanging truth on that story. So that you remember this story, so that you remember, it's easier for you to remember, oh yeah, I remember that press conference. I remember, I was there, or I saw it on TV. I get that image in my mind, and what am I doing? I'm taking that image and I'm hanging the truth on. Yeah, that's how we ought to be. If UK fans can do that, how much more then should people of God be able to do that? If we have believed the gospel and we're going to be in heaven together, we can find a way to get along here, right? So you're using illustration to hang things on. It is tempting for preachers just to use illustrations just because they're fun and you like to tell stories. But they have to serve. Remember, if everything is driven by the text, they have to serve a purpose. And if they don't serve the text, then they don't belong there. They may not be wrong, but they don't fit in the sermon. They have to do something. They have to move us forward, so that everything, whatever your points are, their explanation, illustration, application, you're having to do each of these things. This explanation is not thorough. It is long enough to explain the text that people can simply understand it, but short enough that it can be heard. You can't, so you say you've got 3 main points, and you've got 5 to 6 minutes to set the context for the text, to read the text, and then to introduce the sermon. Here's where we're going. Here's the main point. That takes 5 to 6 minutes. Let's say you've got 3 to 4 to bring the sermon to a close, right? What are we at? 10? Somewhere around 10 already. And let's say you've got 3 main points of your sermon. Let's say you did... So you did 10 minutes on each of these. You're at what already? You're at 40 minutes. So that means then that for each of these, in 10 minutes, you've got to explain the text and illustrate it if you need to, and apply it. Which means then you can't probably spend 9 minutes on explanation.
So would illustration be, the explanation and application required, and illustration optional?
Illustration is optional when it's helpful. And generally, if I don't have an illustration that fits, if you have to explain your illustration, it's probably not good illustration. That it should be pretty self-explanatory. It should fit really well. Because if that illustration takes you a minute to tell, and then you take another minute to explain it, well, that's 2 minutes for an illustration that probably wasn't helpful. So it's got to be quick, and it's got to be serving some purpose. Because again, this isn't a sermon that only has 3 main points. And you're already at 40 minutes. And so learning to do this quickly and to figure out, I need an illustration here, I don't need an illustration here. Sometimes illustration is helpful, both for explanation and application. But one of the things that it does is that it provides a break for the listener. That we can run for about 12 to 15 minutes with deep thought, but then our brains start to turn to mush. And what illustrations do, you hear a story, you hear an example, you hear something, is it sort of gives you a second to come up for a breather before you sort of go back down. And so some of that is just figuring out, hey, I'm going to tell a short illustration here because I think it would be helpful, but also this is a point, man, I've been deep for a bit and I need to come up for air. And this allows everybody to sort of take a breather for a second and before we get back into it. Does that make sense? Okay. So let's move on. We got 20 minutes. We can do this. Let's move on to delivery. So this is a very simple way to preach. Main point is the main point of the text. All your subpoints are driven by the text, and you're connecting them throughout back to showing how they connect back to the text with explanation, illustration, and application. Again, illustration where needed. You may not always have it. Let's talk through delivery. I want to do a quick Well, I'm not going to write it up there. I'm going to have you do this. Okay. Grab a partner who's near you. You got to pair up. I don't know if we have an even number. All right. I'm going to give you, grab a partner near you. I'm going to give you 30 seconds. When I say go, one of you decide which one's going to go first. I'll give you 20 seconds because we're running out of time. I'm going to give you 20 seconds, and I want you to describe your day yesterday. And the person who's not talking, I want you to look them in the eye, okay? Look them in the eye as they're talking until I say look away. And when I tell you to look away, look away. Don't look at your phone, look at your watch, look at the ceiling, look anywhere but at the person who's talking, okay? All right? So find you a partner, and then figure out who's talking and who's not going to talk. Okay, are you ready? All right, talkers, get ready to talk. Listeners, look at them, and then when I tell you look away, look away. All right, go. All right, listeners, look away. Look at your watch, look at your phone. Talkers, keep talking, but listeners, don't look at them. All right, we can stop. All right, for the talkers, how miserable of an experience is it when they look away? It's hard to keep your train of thought. It's hard to keep talking when all of a sudden you're trying to talk and they're looking at their phone, they're looking at the thing. The listeners, how uncomfortable did you feel? You feel what? You feel really rude when they're talking and then you're looking away and you're looking at your watch. So when you think about delivery, one of the first things on the list is eye contact. Is being able to look at people. It is one of the reasons that I agree with Herschel and that generally I would lean away from. There are guys who write full manuscripts and preach from full manuscripts, word for word manuscripts. One of the biggest reasons I think that's unhelpful is that it causes you to lose eye contact, that you're looking down a ton, that there's a difference. Again, if we're talking about not just what we say, but how we say it, the concern, the application, there's a difference in being able to look at somebody in the eyes and say something versus looking down at a sheet of paper. If you've ever noticed, for every sermon, as long as I've been here, almost always, one of the last things out of my mouth or Herschel's mouth or whoever's preaching, one of the last things out of our mouth is the last blank on the page. Do you know why that is? It's the last blank in the sermon outline. Do you know why that is? Yeah. Do you know what happens as soon as that last blank comes? Like we still got some songs, people. We're not going anywhere. So what happens if I say the last blank and I've got 3 more minutes of stuff I want to say? What happens? It's gone. Nobody's looking at me. Nobody's paying attention. They've got the last blank and they've moved on. So that last blank, just sort of let you in, is never really connected to the outline. It is everybody writes their outline and they figure out, okay, I need to sort of come up with another tagline to put on the bottom to sort of have a last word because this is this signifies the end of the sermon. But all my content has to come before that because once that gets said, there's no more eye contact. I have lost everybody. So anything I want to say that I want heard, I need to say before that last line because once the last blank goes up, everybody's done listening. So the rule of preaching is you need to be finished. You need to be finished preaching before people are finished listening, and so you got eye contact is a huge piece of that. Number 2, is gestures and movement. In this would be facial expressions. I'll put this other one up as well.
While you're writing that, Alma in one of his briefings last week said the most important thing you can do to support your pastor is to pay attention to them and look at them.
Is to listen, yeah. Having on when looking out, preaching, looking out. I always say wherever I go, I want to take Stan Noble with me, and anywhere I preach, I want to take Stan because Stan is always locked in. He's looking at me. He's nodding and he's smiling. I don't want to break it to you, but most people look angry when they listen. Most people do. Frank will tell you this. Most people's listening face, they're like. And then, they'll come up after and say, that was so helpful. But like in it, you don't know because they're concentrating. They look angry. So think about that. Smile during the sermon some. We'll talk about, I'll put these together. I'm going to go and throw these up. I'm going to throw all these up here. And then I'll run through them quickly. Humor. Okay. I'm going to leave those for now. So we're thinking through aspects of delivery. We've talked about eye contact. We're going to group a lot of these together. There was a study done. Herschel references this in his book. There was a study done. If we break up the way which we receive communication, if we break it up into three categories: visual, vocal, and verbal. Meaning what we see. The vocal is what we hear, and the verbal is how we hear, like how it is said. So content, like what is said, verbal is how it's said, and then the visual is what we see. So there was a study done several years ago this verbal is what we say, vocal is how we hear it. It's like how it's said, verbal is what we say. If you just take the 100%, right, so what percentage are these weighted and understanding receiving communication? When you receive communication, how much of that communication are you sort of gatekeeping by what you see, by how it's said, or by what is said? Visual.
What is the lowest?
Visual's 55, vocal's 38, and verbal, what is said, the content is 7%. That often you are subconsciously determining whether to listen or to not listen based on what you see and how it's said, not based on the content of what is said. You have these built-in filters. So the way Herschel illustrates this is he tells a story about something that happened to him, a family that he pastored in Ashland. There was this family. They had this little boy. He had like a brand new beagle puppy, and they lived on a highway, sort of like swooped down in the middle. Just really busy highway. They lived right off the highway, and this little boy had this beagle puppy. One day they're out playing in the front yard, and this puppy runs out into the road. Like he gets away from this little boy, and he runs out into the road, and then like as the boy sees, he's calling for him back, and a big semi is like barreling down the highway, and then before the boy can get there, just boom, he just runs over the dog, and this boy's just in the front yard, and he's just crying, and he's I wish you could watch your faces as I tell that story. Yeah. So, how did you respond to the story? Was it according to what I said or what I did? This is what you look like during the story. Why are you smiling? Because I'm smiling. You think this is a funny story. And then you get there, and then Herschel used to tell the story, and it was the boy who got ran over, not the dog. And he was like, it was too much. He said, it was too much for people. He's like, I had to change the story. This is not a true story. But what happens to your brain when you hear that and the dog gets run over, your brain sort of hits the brakes for a minute. And all of you did this. You don't know what to do. The story was straightforward enough, but it's the visual, it's what you see and how you hear me say it that throws your brain off. So in preaching, what your face looks like, the way you say things is really important. This matters, but in communication, if you're saying things and you don't match that in what you look like, you don't match in how you sound, then people tune you out and they never hear what you have to say. So we talked about early on the mood of the sermon matching the mood of the text. So if the sermon is joyful, what do I need to look like in my visual, in my face? How do I need to sound in my voice? I need to sound joyful. If I am preaching about joy, but I look sour and I sound angry, your brain at a subconscious level says, I don't know about that. And you sort of keep it at arm's length. Spurgeon said, to his students, when you preach on heaven, your face ought to shine like the noonday sun. And when you preach on hell, your regular face will do. It is about helping what we look like when we're speaking, how we speak, matching up with what we say. That does matter how you say what you say, because people's brains shut down. So, in that, we've talked about eye contact, that matters. Gestures and movements, in that is facial expressions, right? Showing joy, showing concern, showing warning, showing these things in how we react. Posture and movement, moving in a way that is both natural, that is not distracting, that is not. Herschel has a whole list of these that he goes through in class of just the sort of nervous movements people do with their hands and the way they do stuff and keep their hands here all the time or put them behind their back or
Think about David Miller,
who can't move at all. He can't do any of these. Yeah.
There's always somebody.
Yeah, he can't do any of these.
Throw that on his head.
Trying to move in a way that is not distracting. Doing everything on purpose, not wandering around or not. Herschel says sometimes he sees guys and they look like a lion in a zoo, and they're just sort of like nervously bouncing back and forth. Again, wanting to reflect with every piece of you, your voice, your body, your face, with everything, trying to reflect this, right? Whatever the text says. So that's dress and appearance. When I talk to guys that are like, hey, I'm going to preach somewhere, what should I wear? My advice is always wear whatever is not going to be distracting. Like, do you have to wear a coat to preach a sermon? No, you don't have to. It can still be a sermon without a coat. But if the people, while they're trying to listen to you, are having a separate conversation in their mind, like, what is he wearing? That's unhelpful. You've hurt yourself, right? Do whatever is least distracting. If they're a coat and tie church, wear a coat and tie. If they're untucked button up and that's what they normally, then do that. Whatever fits, so that people aren't having another conversation in their mind. I want the conversation to be about the text, not about what I'm wearing. So that I want to blend in. Whatever is normal, that's what I want to do. So that in dress and appearance, you don't want to look the same. And vocal variety, most people, if you think about sort of vocal range, if this is your full vocal range, what you can do with your voice, most of us never leave sort of this middle range. We're sort of here. And in preaching, sameness is your enemy. So if you say all things exactly the same way, people begin to tune them out. So you're talk about vocal variety, that's speed, that's volume, that's the sort of timbre of your voice, being louder or softer. You're using those things, trying to push those limits that use people. You notice Herschel was really good at this. He would use these moments where he would whisper almost, but we have mics, so you pick it up, we still hear it, but he would take his voice from a big boom down to a small whisper, and what does that naturally do when you lean in? That using this vocal variety brings you back in. If you ever noticed, if a baby cried on the right-hand side of the sanctuary, or somebody dropped a coffee cup that you heard spill for the next 5 minutes, like clink, 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 paid attention. If you watched what Herschel did, if there was a big boom on the right side of the sanctuary, Herschel was going to step to the left side and do something with his voice. What's he doing? He's drawing the eyes back over here. Right, there's a naturally, something happened over there. Everybody wants to look over there. He's going to try to draw you away from the distraction and back over here. So using vocal variety, pushing volume, timbre, speed, all those things to push outside the regular range. Number 6 is word fillers. This is the worst one for everybody. You don't know you do this until you watch yourself preach. These are the words that don't mean anything, that your brain just sticks in because your brain doesn't want to pause. These are the ums and the ers and the rights and the, you know what I mean? Right? I have these. I do these a lot more in teaching than I do in the pulpit. But they are the fillers that your brain says, I cannot pause for a second. There's a break here. I have to put a word in, so I'm going to put a filler word in like right or okay. I'm going to stick this word in before we get to the next thought. And so trying to, in the pulpit, have every word mean something. So that you're cutting out fillers. You're not saying or right. That you're keeping, even as I say you're keeping those words all meaning something, that you're intentional with your words. And then the last one in delivery is humor. This is where, again, understanding what is the aim. If everything is to serve the text, then even humor is to serve the text. So maybe the humor is a particular illustration, that the humor makes it memorable, that allows me to hang, Henry stories, that allow me to hang a particular truth on it. Sometimes, I think often the most useful use of humor is using humor to allow people to bring their guard down. This is what Paul does sometimes. He uses this sarcastic language. The humor brings our guard down, and then Paul sort of punches you with something. Right? So I think this is often the most effective use of humor, is that it sort of draws us in and relaxes us, and then we get this sort of heavy truth laid upon us. It takes our guard down, and then it puts us on it. Dr. York used this years and years ago. I think it was from Malachi. He was getting ready to preach a series through that, and he moved the sermon up into the service without the rest of the pastors knew, but he stepped up to the pulpit ready to preach the sermon. People didn't know that it was the sermon, and he said, "Hey, listen, if you're a visitor with us today, I want you to know, very sorry. We're just gonna have to deal with some family business. I hate that you have to see this." And we have discovered recently that a large sum of money is missing from our budget. And we've talked to all of our pastors, we've talked to everybody that handles those things. We're confident that none of them stole it. We're confident that it has been stolen, but they did not steal it. And so he goes through this whole thing, and people say, "Oh my word, I can't believe this." It's one thing to steal from a corporation or other people, but to steal from the Lord's church that's a very serious thing. People are saying, "Oh my word, I can't believe this." And so he sort of lets this go on for a few minutes and draws people in, and then he says, "But I do need to tell you, the money that was stolen is not money that you gave, but then somebody took. It was money that the Lord called you to give that you never gave." And everybody laughs. And he lets them laugh. And he lets them laugh until the laughter stops. And then he says, "And the fact that you're laughing tells me you think that is less a sin." Boom. And then he goes into Malachi. This is about stealing from the Lord. Now, what is that? That's humor that is drawing people in, so in some sense sort of setting the net for them, and then sort of dropping the hammer on them. I think often if you can do it, it's hard to pull off sometimes. Humor is the most effective means. Again, the danger with humor is, if you're not employing it to actually do something in service to the text, you're going to say stupid things that are going to get you in trouble. You're going to make a joke you shouldn't make. You're going to make fun of somebody. You're going to do something you shouldn't do because you're trying to be cute or clever or funny. Humor has to serve a point for the text. And if it doesn't serve the point, it might be fine, but it doesn't belong in the sermon. Again, if we just think back to these things, I've seen preachers in a 30-minute sermon tell a 4.5-minute story that doesn't really do anything other than be kind of funny. If you're doing a 30-minute sermon and you have a 4.5-minute funny story that doesn't really do much, that's over 10% of your time wasted. That doesn't move the needle at all. That doesn't help you hang anything, doesn't illustrate or explain. All it does is just tell a funny story. Well, that's wasted time. It's not humor for the sake of humor. It's humor that can be used in service to the text, either an explanation or illustration or application. That those things can be helpful. Does that make sense? Okay, so next week, you've got the outline for today. I want you to think through that as you hear the sermon. We'll walk through that text. Next week and sort of do some of this. Talk through text and sermon, and we'll talk through delivery. And, I'll tell you honestly, things I think I did well today and things I didn't do well today, which I'm sure there'll be plenty of things I will wish I had done better in delivery. But think through these things, even as you hear the sermon. Eye contact, gestures and movement, posture, dress, vocal variety, words and fillers, humor. Think through this text in the context of text, sermon, and delivery. So then we'll talk about that next week, and then we'll begin to look at Malachi together, and then work on that sermon together, work on that text, and then start to put together an outline, and then I'll preach that one, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. Okay, let me pray for us, and we'll be done. Father God, we thank you for your kindness to us. We thank you for your word. We pray that you'd be with us as we go to the service today. Help us to honor you and to preach your word faithfully. We pray that you would work in and through your word as you promise us that you will. It's in your son's name we pray. Amen.